Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to another Supatease video. And in this one, we're going to be taking a look at the Balanced Druid as it has been progressing throughout the Shadowlands beta and ultimately to its release on October 27th, which is surprisingly and startlingly very soon. So Balanced Druid was one of the specializations that has been receiving some attention in terms of reworks. I wouldn't say that it is as successful as things like the Shadow Priest rework or the additions to the Marksmanship Hunter. Right now, it seems like it's still going through some growing pains in terms of bringing the whole kit together. But in this video, I just wanted to go over everything that's changing, everything that's new, coming to the Balanced Druid, or in most cases, returning to the Balanced Druid's toolkit that it had in previous expansions. The main goal of this channel, if you're new to the channel, is to sort of be able to provide information to make the correct choice in your gameplay. And what I mean by that is focusing only on performance, so getting details and raid logs and all of this information and then posting it up on my screen and saying, look, this is the best class, is, in my opinion, somewhat irrelevant. It's not totally irrelevant, it's somewhat irrelevant because it's a beta, and likely if you're on the top in the beta, all eyes are on you to get nerfed. So you probably don't even want to be told what is at the top, because that means it's just gonna, maybe you do want to know what's at the top because then you know it's gonna get nerfed if you're dramatically on top. More or less what I'm focused on is how fun and engaging is a specialization. How long do I think I can play a specialization without getting bored of it? And then sort of from there help you decide like what covenants, what conduits, what legendaries to be looking at based on what content you do. So are you someone who likes to only raid? Are you someone who only likes to do Mythic Plus? Are you someone who just wants to quest and do battlegrounds? Are you someone who wants to do competitive arenas and rated battlegrounds? Are you a Mythic raider? Like, I'm trying to consider the entire spectrum of a player in WoW. Are you someone who wants to do everything? And that's the main goal of the channel. But now let's get to the meat and potatoes here of the Balanced Druid. So one of the best returning spells to the Balanced Druid and Druid kit in general is Cyclone. This ability has great potential in PvP, obviously, as it's probably the best crowd control in the game. Some drawbacks is that to time a Cyclone chain can be difficult because you have to hit it within a specific window when the target isn't immune, but also doesn't have much time to cast another spell. So I would argue it's the highest skill cap and best crowd control in the game. So if you're interested in that for PvP, it's definitely a nice addition. In PvE, it stands to also be unbelievably insane depending on if they allow certain trash mobs to actually be cyclonable and not immune to it. So you can stop negative effects like necrotic stacks by cycloning in a monster that's chasing your tank and let the necrotic stacks fall off. It also prevents healing, so if a mob's about to drop Sanguine, you could cyclone the other mob next to it, immune to it, maybe just in time at the end of the cyclone, someone has a death grip or a knockback to push it out of the Sanguine puddle and stop it from healing. So depending on how they want this to work in PvE, it could also be a very high skill cap spell in PvE. Iron Fur is returning, although, you know, it's just if you want to shapeshift into bear for a moment, maybe while you're solo questing as Guardian Affinity, or maybe if you are in a dungeon, your tank dies, in your Guardian Affinity, switching to bear form, you can temporarily fill the role. It seems like that is being hammered down pretty heavily on the Druid class in general, is that they want to open up your ability to shapeshift. In competitive play, you probably never do it, right? But if you're just average player, maybe your tank isn't the best, your healer isn't the best, and like you have a little moment to shine, you'll be able to get that moment to shine. And it's just nice to have a little couple extra buttons to think about pressing in bear form in terms of bolstering up your defense. Moving forward, Stampeding Roar, excellent utility across the entire game. Just great for moving your raid across certain mechanics, as it's raid wide. It's a nice little sprint effect. Nice for personal survivability in PvP. Great in Mythic Plus for just moving your group faster through the dungeon. I'm very happy to see Stampeding Roar return to the kit for Druid, and then that's included for Balanced Druid. Baseline spells, I'm just double checking. So some things we can go over is that Shooting Stars, which if you've played Balanced Druid, was a talent on the final row, where your Moonfire and Sunfire damage over time has a chance to call down a falling star, dealing a little bit of damage and generating 2 astral power. This in a recent patch has been made baseline, which means at all times your damage over time effects have a chance to generate astral power. One of the biggest problems with Balanced Druid at the moment, and everybody knows this from watching my videos, is I love dots. Their dots don't really do anything. And I'm talking specifically about tuning now because they have been tuning it. Recently, Balanced Druid got a 10% buff to their damage over time effects, which at the moment we're hitting for 100 damage before the buff, and now they're hitting for 130, which is nothing. I have 21,000 health. So I'm not sure if they don't want your dot damage to be at the top. Maybe they're concerned that because Sunfire, I believe, isn't capped on enemies, it's all enemies still. So maybe they're concerned that being able to apply Sunfire to too many monsters in a dungeon will cause Balanced Druid damage to exceed capacity or something. I could also see in random battlegrounds. I think no matter what, Balanced Druid's in a position where in a random battleground, it's just going to have top damage in the meter. You just, especially with Starfall being relevant now, you just put Sunfire on 40 people in AV and press Starfall. Your top damage. Is it relevant? Like the damage that you're doing, is it really relevant? Not really. But on the scoreboard, it says you're number one. So maybe they're really concerned with that, and that's why they don't want the dots to do anything. But 130 damage is so minor in comparison to Star Surge, which crits for 4k there. So I don't know if the 10% damage buff is going to be enough. Another change to our baseline spell is instead of having empowerments, which in the past when you casted Star Surge, you would get empowerments that increase the damage of your Wrath and your Starfire and some other effects on them. Instead, when you cast 2 Wraths, you will enter a lunar eclipse. While in a lunar eclipse, your Starfire is faster, it does more damage, right? So Starfire becomes more effective during it. And now with the recent change, it will only last 15 seconds. So you've got 15 seconds in that window, and every Star Surge that you pump out during that window will increase the effectiveness of that lunar eclipse. So if I go into, will I be able to? I think I might be on a rotation where I'm going into solar. So we'll go into solar first. Now the Star Surges that I pump in here will increase the effectiveness of my eclipse. So now my Wrath is doing more damage over time rather than Star Surge was originally going to be enhancing the effect. This means that as the eclipse is about to end, it's probably a better priority to hold your astral power and wait for the next eclipse and then start amping up your eclipse with the Star Surge damage. So as I pump in more, the area effect damage is increased by 150%. It doesn't seem like the other benefits, like reducing its cast speed or its crit chance, increase for the Star Surge. It's purely the AoE damage. So in PvP, you wouldn't care about that, right? Because the AoE damage is already negligible from Starfire. The direct damage from your Wrath is somewhat useful. This in PvE is great and it's going to feel awesome. In PvP, it's not. You're going to proc an Eclipse. You're not going to get a single cast off because it's PvP and you're being attacked. Or you're going to have to do something else like crowd control somebody. So I see this being really difficult to pull off in PvP specifically. In PvE, it's probably going to feel awesome and great, but in PvP, not so much. And then your other resource spender, Starfall, which receives some buffs, instead of being put on the ground, let me just get enough astral power to press it. When you press Starfall, it's going to go around yourself and call stars down. And right now, Starfall hits really hard, and it hits a ton of targets. So it's obviously going to be a monster in PvE, probably a monster in random battlegrounds in terms of tapping up your pad damage. If you like being number one on the random BG damage meter, it's going to be in a good spot for that. Now, does it directly impact your Eclipse, though? Doesn't look like it. So you're not going to be able to increase your single target throughput by using Starfall. Starfall merely extends the duration of your damage over time effects that basically do nothing anyway. So Starfall would be only used for multi-target damage. It doesn't really have much other interactions with the kit other than extending the dots that don't do anything. Yeah, so with this rework, I think I'm almost wondering if it's going to end up panning out, because in reality it's basically the same thing, right, as BFA. So Eclipse is literally starts with E, and empowerments, these are basically the same thing, except you got empowerments from Star Surge rather than your casted spells. You could sit on those empowerments as long as you wanted to. So if you had to move or you had to do something, you didn't lose the empowerment. You just continued on with your rotation after the moment in time where you were disrupted. With this, you have only a very small amount of time to cast the spells that you would like to cast that are enhanced. And if you don't cast them during this window of time, you completely lose out on the bonus. So unless the damage increase is dramatic, which the Eclipse bonuses are pretty lackluster, the AoE damage on Starfire, for example, in PvE, that's great. In PvP, it's totally useless. You don't care. Having a 15-second window to do this, just I don't see it working out in PvP. I mean, I'm going to have to play with it more, and hopefully there's more appropriate PvP testing, but it's a big concern for me at the moment. It's strange to me because it just feels the same as empowerments, except they're just more annoying to use version of the empowerments. We still have Astral Power, so that didn't go away from BFA. And then the empowerments were replaced with Eclipse, which is just, yeah, it's just a little bit more of an awkward version of it. But if you're a PvEer, you're going to be happy Starfall is back and it's doing a ton of damage. Other than that, we get Typhoon baseline, super great addition to the utility of the kit. Utility is definitely a plus on the class in PvP. If that's something you were looking for, to have returned to the spec, it's definitely a big bonus. Celestial Alignment will at least now work with your Star Surge, because Star Surge increases your Eclipse effectiveness. So Celestial Alignment feels a little bit better to utilize in between, in terms of you don't need to worry about extending your Eclipse. It's just going to increase the effectiveness of it. But at the moment, it seems pretty difficult juggling the amount of astral power that you're able to generate. Your dots don't really do too much. The utility is great. You're going to be able to bounce between a lot of different crowd control effects, sprint effects for your group, and that's going to be super awesome. But the damage rotation is, to me, doesn't feel like it's much of an improvement over BFA. It seems like it's very similar and just more hard to pull off. Some of the talents have been readjusted. One of the baseline effects, if you've watched a lot of my Druid videos, you've heard this before, but Feral Affinity gets Maim, Guardian Affinity gets Incapacitating Roar, and Restoration Affinity gets Ursul's Vortex. So again, hammering down on the affinities and the shapeshifting element of the Druid. And all of these spells are likely to be increased and enhanced with Heart of the Wild. Heart of the Wild could have a lot of potential in this expansion, especially with some Legendaries and Conduits when we get to that section of the video. So I'm glad to see it come back. Curious to see if it ends up being utilized. And now Soul of the Forest has been enhanced. So instead of just increasing Wrath or Starfire's damage, it's going to modify them slightly. So when you're in Solar Eclipse, your Wrath generates more astral power, and when you're in Lunar Eclipse, your Starfire crits more. Do note that this is competing with Star-Lord and Incarnation. I'm curious to see with all the changes if Incarnation ends up falling off more. Maybe Star-Lord to get your haste up, because your stats are going to be dropping dramatically moving into Shadowlands. So maybe Star-Lord, but Soul of the Forest felt pretty good. The downside is in something like PvP, it's only your casted abilities, which were already not super easy to do. But in PvE, maybe it makes it more competitive now, especially going pull to pull in dungeons. Now, to replace Shooting Stars, we've got Solstice, which basically just buffs Shooting Stars. So during the first 6 seconds of Eclipse, so when you enter Eclipse, you'll also get a benefit that your Shooting Stars fall 300%. Shooting Stars fall 300%. That sentence seems like it's missing a few words. I'm going to assume that means 300% more frequently or something, which means you're generating more astral power right as you hit the Eclipse. So you get your dots up right on the target, and then you would enter Eclipse. And then with this talent, all of the dots that you have up are going to start generating you a lot of astral power. And then the more dots you have, the more likelihood that this is proccing. And then the more often you'd want to be flipping to the next Eclipse as soon as possible. And then when you flip over to the next Eclipse, as soon as you flip over to it, you're going to get the Solstice again, where your dots are generating you more astral power. But it's not really your dots. It's like the Shooting Stars from your dots. It's like your dots are there to give you Shooting Stars only, and the dots themselves don't really matter. That's going to have really big drawbacks when we get to the Covenants, which is pretty much after this. We've covered most of the new talents. Honor talents, nothing's changing. So a little bit disappointed. Obviously, we got some really cool honor talents baseline, which is great, but it's not really anything happening with the honor talents. So nothing to look forward to there. But now when we get into the Covenant section for the Necro Lords, what are the strengths? You had a pretty sick looking transmog. Best mount in the game. You'll get Fleshcraft, Channeled Shield, and then you can go into Soulbind, so while you're channeling it, you're immune to crowd control. If you complete the channel, you're immune to crowd control for 4 more seconds, so preempting incoming stuns in PvP is definitely going to be utilized with this. In PvE and PvP, it's also just a shield that absorbs damage, and then in PvE, you might be able to time this to avoid certain mechanics. This ability I was initially very excited about trying, the Adaptive Swarm. If you played Balanced Druid in the past, you'd remember Insect Swarm, so it had a little bit of a nostalgia flavor to it just with the name. 25-second cooldown, you command a swarm that will heal or deal damage depending on what you're targeting. So you put this on an enemy, it does damage, and it buffs the effectiveness of your periodic effects on the target that's currently active by 20%. But if you're buffing 20% of 0, because your dots do 0, this thing is just, I feel like, going to fall off really hard. It is a really cool and awesome spell, and it would be great in the kit if the dots did damage, relevant damage, but they don't. So utilizing this successfully for the Balanced Druid, I think it's going to end up being pretty weak. But for things like Resto Druid, it's great because it'll scale with your mastery, enhancing your heal over time effects. So Resto Druid, it seems really awesome, but for Balanced Druid, not so great. So let's take a look at them. You got the Fleshcraft. You could be channeling this and be immune to crowd control, and if you complete it, you'd be immune for 4 more seconds. We've got the Adaptive Swarm, so we'll put our damage over time effects up on the target, Sunfire and Moonfire. We'll apply Adaptive Swarm. Our dots go from 130 damage to about 150 to 180. I think there is some spell variance, so the numbers are never going to be exactly the same. And then when the Adaptive Swarm finishes on an enemy target, it bounces to an ally. So I'm the only ally, so it'll bounce back to me. It'll increase all heal over time effects on myself while active by 20% and heal me. And then when it expires, it will bounce back over to an enemy and then buff the damage over time effect. So you can see if you started it as a heal, it would work as a heal twice. But as Balanced Druid, you don't really have a lot of good heal over time effects, so I wouldn't recommend that. It's definitely better as a damage over time amplifier. The main problem with it is that the dots themselves don't do any damage. And I'm only really talking about tuning right now in this video because it has been patched to be 10% more damage, so I don't think 10% was enough. Regardless, the Necrolords could be good depending on the tuning that they do to our dots. Over here for the Venthyr, got Door of Shadows. Mobility, not really a problem for Balanced Druid. The advantages with it is that it's on Shadow, so if you kicked on it, you can still do a lot of other things. You can bait interrupts with it. And then Ravenous Frenzy, which would have really good synergies with Celestial Alignment and really good synergies with Incarnation, that 3-minute window timing. Ravenous Frenzy is just 3-minute cooldown for 20 seconds. Druid spells you cast increase your damage, healing, and haste by 2%, and the stacks. But if you spend 1.5 seconds idle, so 1.5 seconds without pressing anything, the frenzy will overcome you. It will do a lot of damage to you, and it will stun you for 1 second and end. So this could be really fun in PvE where you're not likely to kind of get boned ramping this thing up to maximum potential, and then synergizing it with Incarnation, and then also getting the Eclipse damage bonuses from your Star Surges. I see it having really good potential. The downside in PvP is that if anybody sees you activate this and they realize how much of a threat it is, all they have to do is crowd control you for 1.5 seconds, which is not very long. In a lot of cases, you might not even be able to use something like a Gladiator's Medallion before 1.5 seconds has elapsed. And if you use it on that, then you're susceptible to losing later on in the game if you're using your Gladiator's Medallion to escape crowd control to do damage, which is generally a pretty risky maneuver. So will the damage benefit outweigh the downside in PvP? I'm a little bit uncertain, but in PvE, it seems like it could be a lot of fun. You do get the advantages of the Venthyr passives. One of them, which I think is going to be the best in PvP, which is General Draven. When below 40% health, you take 10% less damage. So just defensive stance, basically, when you're below 40% health. And also, you can talent into 25% interrupt reduction, which if you're going to be casting a lot on Balanced Druid in PvP, maybe that helps bring up the weaknesses and the drawbacks of the rework that's happened to Balanced Druid in PvP specifically. But let's take a look at the abilities. You got the Door of Shadows. Again, just a teleport. If you're interrupted, you can still do all of your other abilities. And then for Ravenous Frenzy, you would want to activate it with Incarnation, right? So you would go Ravenous Frenzy, Celestial Alignment, get your damage over time effects rolling as quickly as possible. You might have to avoid casting things like Starfire, because I don't know if you'd have enough time to finish the cast before the Ravenous Frenzy overcomes you. It might just be better to stay focused on Solar Wrath, or maybe even just only use instant cast spells just to stack up the haste even faster. And then that would be your little burst window. So it's kind of like this high intensity moment. And it synergizes well with your kit because you've got 3-minute cooldown that lines up with it. Celestial Alignment. If you ran Incarnation, it would be even more haste to the effectiveness of it. So it has some cool synergies there. Big drawbacks in PvP though, which make me a little bit hesitant. But then the passives of the Venthyr might make up for that. When we look at the Night Fae, I feel like this is the one that's looking like it's going to be the most fun and the best for maybe even Druid in general, not even just Balanced Druid, but for Night Fae, you get this is a pretty cool looking mog for leather wearers too. I've got a lot of staves that would look good with that. And you get the little goat, but you'll get Soul Shape. Again, don't really care about mobility. Actually, initially this had drawbacks that it moved slower than your other shapeshift forms. They've buffed it now. So it'll be moving faster, but you can't cast any other spells while in the Soul Shape form, so you can only go into it and start blinking. It would be good. Just having extra mobility isn't a bad thing. Maybe you'll finally be able to escape a Demon Hunter. Ha, unlikely. But you would get this. It would be useful against melee DPS that don't have infinite mobility like Retribution Paladins. Convoke the Spirits, though. This is the one that is kind of looking the most attractive for the Night Fae. It's a 2-minute cooldown, and while you channel it, you just cast 16 Druid spells over 4 seconds. You're kind of stunning yourself for 4 seconds in the channel, right? You can only do those spells, but that 16 spells in a 4-second window of time is a lot of spells. And it seems like it has the most impact in balance form. So let's just give it a test. The little Vulpin, again, you just get to blink around. Pretty cool. And then it has a limited duration outside of the city, so don't expect it to last forever. But when you come out into balance form and you press Convoke the Spirits, you basically just start going bazooka crazy and launching out tons of damage and tons of spells. Now, if you isolate a target, it's going to be amazing single target burst in PvP. In PvE, you don't really care unless there's some mobs that you want to ignore, which does happen in PvE. There's sometimes monsters that either are immune to damage or infinitely heal themselves, so putting any damage into them is considered pad or not relevant. So in those situations, it wouldn't be that great because it might Star Surge one of those monsters, but I feel like those situations don't happen very often. Like that might be one raid boss out of an entire tier, and then that's it. This little window of time has drawbacks similarly to the Venthyr, but at least it's not, you don't have to tie it with your Celestial Alignment. So if you get shut down, you lose 2 cooldowns as Venthyr. You could utilize this as its own little cooldown and try and split it up in PvP. And it just looks really cool, right? Like it's one of my favorite abilities. The other benefits of the Night Fae on their passive talent trees is that they have slows, which Balanced Druid doesn't have. So that's just a nice little addition along with it. And you also get, I believe, Cheat Death. So you don't have Cheat Death, we have Battle Res, but getting Cheat Death would be nice if you're the only Battle Res in a group, and then you can Cheat Death and then utilize your Battle Res on somebody else. So overall, Night Fae seems like a really good pick for the game, and it's also pretty fun. When we look at the Kyrian, we're going to get little Armored Angel here. That recent cinematic was definitely awesome, the one with Uther and Arthazu, and checked it out for Bastion. Don't know what you're doing with your time if you haven't, but you should definitely check it out. We got the Tiger, we got the Transmog, we got the Steward, which we now know the Vial will work in PvP, which is a great bonus here for the Kyrian in PvP. In PvE, you probably care, but not so much about stuff like that. Instead, Kindred Spirits, which is the Covenant ability, 200 mana, 2.3 second cast, form a bond with an ally every 1 minute. You may empower the bond for 10 seconds, granting you an effect based on your partner's role and granting them effect based on your role. So you're just making them better at healing, better at tanking, better at doing damage, and the same to yourself. Or if you use it on yourself, I think you just get a flat damage buff. So if you're just solo questing, it still has a use. So we'll take a look at it. Would have been nice to have somebody here to cast it on. I guess we could actually, can we? No, that's not a person. Okay, we have to just cast it on ourselves. We have no friends. So if we cast this on ourselves, Kindred Spirits, we'll get a buff. We're connected to ourselves. Every 1 minute we may empower this bonus. So every minute we can increase our damage by 15%. That's really good. Just pretty straightforward. Just pop that off, 15% more damage. We could time that with our Celestial Alignment every 3 minutes, which I probably should have pressed at the same time. So we could get a really beefy damage boost. I would have said that the Necrolord would be better if our dots were more relevant, whereas the Kindred Spirits benefits our other spells which do relevant damage, like Star Surge. We could bank up a ton of astral power, go into an Eclipse, pop this, super power up our Eclipse with all the Star Surges that we've saved up, maybe synergize it with some Legendaries to get some free astral power spenders as well, and then have a huge burst dump window in PvP. And it's a little bit more consistent because it's a 1 minute cooldown. It would line up with those Eclipse windows a bit better. You would also get the utility of the heal and the bleed and disease dispel effects. And also Kyrian in their Soulbind talent tree have reductions to polymorphs, which you don't really care as a Balanced Druid, but stuns. So if you're standing still, which you will to cast spells a lot as Balanced Druid, for a certain amount of time, don't remember the exact number, all incoming stuns on you are reduced by, I believe, 30%. So if you're doing your rotation, and then in PvP, the big drawback is that you have to stand still and cast, this might help you because then when the rogue stuns you, you're disrupted for a much less amount of time. So Kyrian is actually looking a lot more competitive to me with the way that they've changed the Eclipse system and the way that Star Surge empowers our Eclipse rather than extending it. So we might be able to save these up for really good burst windows. It's a 1 minute cooldown, lines up well with Solar Beam in PvP. So every minute on Solar Beam, we'd have this big burst window. So Kyrian is actually looking much more appealing to me overall. And maybe the Convoke the Spirits build could be fun, but again, big drawbacks. Venthyr could be fun, big drawbacks. Necrolord could be fun and awesome, but our dots don't do anything. And then Kyrian seems like it would be good just all around. I think in all content, you could make it work. It might not be the top performer, but I think that you could find a spot to make it work. And that's it for the Covenant section of the video. Let's go over and take a look at the Legendaries, which Balanced Druid is getting a lot of awesome Legendaries. We jump over here, we got general legendaries. So these are any spec of Druid, Circle of Life and Death. I was initially very impressed with this one, but then now after realizing that our dots don't do anything, much less so. Your damage over time effects deal their damage in 25% less time, and your healing over time effects occur in 15% less time. So your dots don't do anything, doing it faster doesn't matter. I don't think you'll want to be going for this legendary unless dots receive a massive buff. Drought of Deep Focus, the second legendary. When Moonfire, Rake, Rip, or Rejuve are on a single target, so you only have one Moonfire, their damage effects are increased by 30%. It's probably not worth it for Balanced Druid. I don't see this being in a good spot. Maybe as a single target Feral Druid only, it might have a spot because you get two of your spells buffed. But maybe there's some cheesy Heart of the Wild though with Feral Affinity. I kind of doubt it. Lycaria's Fleeting Glimpse, the third legendary. Every 45 seconds while in combat, you basically just cast a spell based on your form. If you're not in a shapeshift form, you'll cast a Wild Growth. So in a rage, you might care about that. And again, you're a Balanced Druid, right? As a Resto Druid, that seems really good. But as a Balanced Druid, you probably don't care too much about Wild Growth. If you're in cat form, you'll cast Primal Wrath, which is just an AoE rip. Again, probably don't care about that too much as a Balanced Druid. In bear form, you'll get Bark Skin. You don't have control of it. It's every 45. So you might know the window's coming up, go into bear form to get Bark Skin. I guess it could activate, then switch back, and then you just got Bark Skin. In PvP, you might fake someone out into them thinking you pressed Bark Skin. But in terms of its practicality, will it ever actually line up with a mechanic? It seems pretty unlikely. Starfall is really good, though. That seems like the one that you would want to cast with this legendary. And you're just already in Moonkin form, so every 45 seconds you'll cast Starfall. And then if you run the Move All casting talent during Starfall, you've got really good synergies there. If you're in travel form, you'll cast Stampeding Roar. The main thing for me is I feel like these general legendaries can't compete with the throughput potential of the Balanced Druid ones, so they're not really standing out to me. The fourth legendary for general druids, though, Oath of the Elder Druid. This one seemed really awesome for resto druids who utilize their affinities a lot more than Balanced Druids do. The effectiveness of your thick hide, so your damage reduction, your astral influence, your range, your feline swiftness, your movement speed, and your Ysera's gift, your healing is increased by 75%. And when you shift into the affinity's form, you gain Heart of the Wild for 10 seconds. So if you are running a Resto affinity, when you I would assume when you shapeshift out of form, you would gain Heart of the Wild for 10 seconds, which would make your Swiftmen really strong every minute. Every minute, your Swiftmen would probably be a lay on hands or close to it with Heart of the Wild. And then your Ysera's gift would also be healing more during that 10-second window of time. So might have good synergies there. For if you were Guardian affinity, it would make your Frenzy regen have 2 charges, so you would be able to lay on hands yourself pretty immediately. So this could have really good potential in duels, like PvP 1v1, maybe random battlegrounds if you don't have a healer. It'll give you a lot more survivability. And potentially things like Torghast. If you're running a solo Torghast run and you're struggling with survivability, this would give you a lot because it's Heart of the Wild every minute. And if you're a Guardian affinity, you would just be able to Frenzy regen twice to full health every minute. So it would have potential in solo play, but I think competitive play, probably not so much. That might be a legendary I go for second, because I like doing things like random BGs, and I think being effective in Torghast will be important. But for Balanced Druid specific legendaries, we've got Balance of All Things. When you enter Eclipse, you increase your critical strike chance with arcane and nature spells by 105%, but it decreases 15% every second. This could have really good synergies with the Kyrian bonus, just amping up your damage. And then right as you hit that Eclipse timing, like I was saying, and then dump in a ton of Star Surges that... It says Arcane and Nature. I don't know if Star Surge is considered Arcane or Nature. That's something that I would have to test out. If it is, then your Star Surges would get 105% crit. So you hit that timing, get an Eclipse, Solar Beam a healer in PvP, and then pop off with the Kyrian Empowerment, and then Star Surge with 100% crit, buff up your Eclipses, and then start pumping up big Wraths. Maybe I'm actually changing my mind about Balanced Druid, its competitive viability in PvP. Maybe I'm changing my mind just a little bit with some of these legendaries, if it works like that. The other one, which was my favorite legendary in Legion, Onus Clear Vision, Star Surge and Starfall have a 15% chance to make the other free. So really good, because generating astral power is quite a headache. Also, if you're just purely focused on empowering your Eclipses, then getting a random Starfall for free with Movecast is definitely a big benefit. To me, this one would be a pretty good one to get just for everything in the game. Pretty safe. Primordial Arcanic Pulsar. I was never a big fan of Arcanic Pulsar in BFA when it was an Azerite trait. I'm still not a really big fan of it as a legendary either. You have to spend 300 astral power, and then you'll get Celestial Alignment or Incarnation if you're running that for 9 seconds. It seems like a big headache to keep track of. Did you spend 300 astral power right before you entered an Eclipse? Because then you would get the maximum benefit of the Eclipse. It seems like a pretty big headache legendary. I'm kind of somewhat hoping it's not good performance-wise, because it is actually a bit of a headache to track 300 astral power used, as opposed to the way in BFA where you had a number at the top on your buffs that said you casted 1 Star Surge 2. I don't know where this is going to be tracked, because astral power spent rather than Star Surge casted. I do suppose that's so that you can use Starfall as well and still work towards it. Time-worn Dreambinder. Star Surge and Starfall reduce the cost of Star Surge and Starfall by 15% for 6 seconds, stacking up to 2 times. That also has really good synergies in that PvP window of time I was talking about, where you could Kyrian damage buff yourself, pump out a bunch of Star Surges that are at reduced cost and increased damage. That could be a lot of fun. To me, in PvP, Boomkin is going to probably more or less just devolve down to getting a ton of Star Surges in a very small window of time and bursting somebody down with Solar Beam. Which, I mean, it somewhat has always been for a while like that. But getting this whole casted rotation in Eclipse online, when it's very similar to the old Void form for Shadow Priest, where you have this limited time to get all your damage out, and if you get crowd controlled or interrupted on it, then you kind of lose out on the bonus. The drawbacks of that are going to probably be too great, but you can maybe somewhat get around it with these legendaries and maybe some of the covenants. Specifically the Kyrian one is actually drawing my attention. That's a big change, because I was actually not really paying attention to Kyrian before, but now looking at some of these legendaries and their synergies, looking at it a lot more. So this one seems pretty awesome. The Time-worn Dreambinder. And then finally, we've got the conduits, which are just basically gem sockets in Shadowlands that you're going to put into your Covenant talent tree. Potency is damage, and that's what we're going to look at first here for the Balance Druid. Fury of the Skies. Moonfire increases your arcane damage to the target, and Sunfire increases your nature damage to the target by 3%. So again, trying to make your dots relevant without actually making them do damage. It's kind of interesting. I almost wonder why they're even dots and they're not just kind of like damage increase effects that you put on the target. I guess it's cool that they function as both, but it seems like the identity of Moonfire and Sunfire is to be a lot less about them being dots and more about them empowering your Eclipse windows, which is, I guess, just going to be a readjustment, and I don't like change, so I'm initially having a negative response to it. Precise alignment. Duration of celestial alignment is increased by 4 seconds. That would have good synergies with the legendary the Arcanic Pulsar legendary that just after 300 astral power you get celestial alignment. It would last 4 seconds longer. That's actually making that legendary a lot more appealing. If you were to run this conduit with it, I think you would have to run that legendary with this conduit. This conduit with just your baseline Eclipse doesn't seem all too great. It's okay. And then Stellar Inspiration, Star Surge, and Starfall have an 8% chance to extend your Eclipse, or Moonfire and Sunfire by an additional 3 seconds. So Starfall extends your dots. Probably don't care about that. It's not too hard to get your dots up. Sunfire applies to everything. You can get Twin Moonfire to get Moonfire up really quickly. So extending your dots you don't really care about. It would more or less be extending your Eclipse. And again, really big bonuses with the Kyrian. And also really good bonuses with those legendaries that make Star Surge and Starfall free respectively with a chance or reduce their costs. So really good synergies with the conduits and the legendary so far in the potency category. Umbral Intensity. Eclipse grants Wrath and Starfire a 20% stronger damage increase. So you just immediately get the benefit of it without having to ramp it up. This probably would be a good one if you're not going for any of those legendaries, but I feel like you're going to want to go for the legendaries that synergize here with Star Surge and Starfall. So you can increase your nature, and I guess it would increase the dot damage as well, right? So it might, maybe that's why our dots don't do damage now, is that when this conduit that increases your arcane and nature damage levels up, that will then make the damage over time effects more relevant. I'm trying to look into this and peer into the future, right? Because with the conduits, while I said they're sockets, there are sockets that power up over time, and their effectiveness will become stronger. We'll just become stronger. That's what the sentence is. Keep it simple, stupid. But this one that grants you 20% more damage would give you really... no, never mind. I'm wrong. It's only to Starfire and Wrath. It's a little bit unfortunate. I was thinking like you hit that Eclipse timing and then you pop your Kyrian empowerment and then go big ham on Star Surge. If it's only your Wraths and Starfire, that would have good advantages in PvE, but at the moment I'm more interested in this Star Surge extending, or actually just the flat nature damage and arcane damage during your dots. So you'll have two types of potency conduits. You'll have those ones that just increase the damage of your class, and then you will have these ones that increase the effectiveness of your specific Covenant spell. So for Kyrian, your empowerment cooldown is reduced, so it loses the benefit of lining up with your solar beam, but you would be able to empower your eclipses more frequently. In PvE, that's great. In PvP, depending on if you can actually kill a target outside of the healer being crowd controlled, it might not be that great of a benefit. But for the Kyrian, your Ravenous Frenzy, so that one where you keep casting spells, you go faster, do more damage. If you stop, you get hit hard and you get stunned. This will increase your critical strike chance by 2% per stack. Great for PvE. PvP, you don't really care about crit. It's not that big of a benefit. And then for Necrolord, the Adaptive Swarm, that was really cool spell, but doesn't synergize with your dots if your dots don't do anything, will increase their periodic effects by an additional 6%. So 6% again of 0 is still not a lot, unfortunately. So for Balance Druid, it's kind of fallen off and it's losing my attention. Conflux of Elements for Night Fae. While channeling Convoke the Spirits, your damage and healing are increased by 12%. So you get an even bigger burst window during Convoke the Spirits. That seems like if you were going to run Night Fae, you would want to have this conduit. You can only have one of each conduit. So getting this conduit to increase your damage by 12% during its burst window, and then maybe the conduit while your dots are up, you do more damage to the target. I could see that being a good synergizing one, or maybe the Stellar Inspiration one seems like it could be pretty mandatory, where your Star Surge has a chance to extend your Eclipse. and then getting really long eclipses that are also buffed up by your Star Surge. Seems like it could end up being pretty mandatory. But that's it for Covenant Potency. We will move on to Endurance, which we skipped over because there's actually so few of them. Endurance is defense, so tough as bark. Your bark skin's cooldown is reduced by a certain amount of percent. That's really good. I mean, you could get your bark skin down to maybe a 30-second cooldown ranking this up. That's really good. In all content, just getting your damage reduction cooldown for raid boss damage windows, getting your damage reduction cooldown in PvP more frequently. That's really strong. Earth Sign Vigor for 4 seconds after shifting into bear form, your health and armor are increased. Good synergies to buff up your frenzied regen, but if you're not running Guardian Affinity, it doesn't have really good synergies. Seems like the bark skin one would just be good for everything in all situations. Innate Resolve, regrowth, and frenzied regeneration healing is increased by 12% on yourself. Again, really big bonuses to that healing. If you wanted to run that legendary that gives you Heart of the Wild every minute when you shapeshift, this would make you a strong dueler. Maybe even one of the best dueling specs in the game for PvP, 1v1 specs, because you would just heal so much. Which is generally what determines whether or not a spec is the best in dueling, is if you can't die. So this has great potential there, but in all other aspects of the game, probably loses out on its value as opposed to just getting your bark skin more frequently. Finesse Conduits, this is utility. Born Anew, rebirth grants the target 50% movement speed for 8 seconds and well fed. I don't really care about that. I feel like you don't, even in PvE, you probably don't really care about that. If somebody died, you've already messed up enough that it's not a big deal that you res them with well fed. Not really paying attention to this one. Front of the pack, Stampeding Roar's radius and duration are increased by 15%. Really good for raids. Not so much value in Mythic Plus or arenas though, but would be really good for raids, but more likely only on like maybe 1 or 2 bosses, because it's usually 1 or 2 bosses in a raid that are designed where you need a mobility like this. So it's not really drawing me in too much. Born of the Wilds, the cooldown of your Mighty Bash, Mass Entanglement, and Heart of the Wild are reduced by 10%. That seems nuts. So you could get your Heart of the Wild down pretty heavily there. 5-minute cooldown by 10%, and the 10% increases as the conduit levels up. That seems like the conduit that I'm getting. Tireless Pursuit. For 2 seconds after leaving cat form or travel form, you retain their movement speed bonus. Maybe if you're a flag carrier, that would be good in PvP. In everything else, probably don't really care. I think getting your Heart of the Wild more frequently, or your Mass Entanglement more frequently as well on bosses where you need to utilize Mass Entanglement to root walls that spawn and start walking, seems like that's where you would want to go. But yeah, so initially when I was looking at Balanced Druid, I was pretty concerned about it after its most recent what do you want to say, alterations. I'm still a little bit concerned about it. The main drawback is, how is this Eclipse system going to work as opposed to the old empowerment system in PvP? The Legendaries could save the spec in terms of performance, but I'm worried about it, and that's my alarm going off, so maybe we should end the video. But overall, it looks pretty awesome for PvE. I'm glad Starfall is more relevant, but I'm a bit worried about it in PvP. If you like the video, subscribe to the channel. If you want to check out my other class reviews, I'll have them linked above. And also my tier list, which I think I'm going to revise for ranged DPS because they continue to update the ranged DPS specs. And aside from that, we'll see you in the next one.